The large house stood quietly on the hill, its tall windows glowing faintly under the evening sky. People in the town often spoke about it with mixed feelings. Some admired its beauty and size, while others whispered that the man who owned it was difficult and proud. Inside that house lived a wealthy tycoon who had built his empire through years of strict decisions and sharp words. Many people respected him, but few liked him. The staff who worked in his mansion knew his nature well. He did not shout, but when he spoke, his tone carried a cold sharpness that felt heavier than shouting. He paid well, but he expected absolute perfection. A dish placed a little crooked on the table or a small smudge on the floor could turn his mood stormy. Yet people worked for him because his name carried weight, and his mansion offered steady income. One morning, a new maid arrived. At the house, she was soft-spoken, kept her eyes low, and moved with gentle steps. The older staff welcomed her with polite nods and warm smiles. They hoped she would not leave too quickly. Many new workers had come before her, but left after a few weeks unable to tolerate the pressure. But she looked determined, even if a little nervous, as though she had experienced harder days elsewhere. She was given a small room in the back wing of the mansion and a long list of tasks. She followed instructions carefully, keeping her mind focused on her work. She tried not to draw attention to herself. The fewer mistakes she made, the fewer reasons the tycoon would have to speak to her. For the first few days, things seemed peaceful. She cleaned, organized, and dusted without much trouble. The head housekeeper even complimented her for being quick and quiet. But she noticed something in the mansion that caught her eye every time she passed by the main hall. A grand piano stood like a silent giant, polished to a soft shine, untouched most of the time. She could not help but slow down whenever she walked past it. Something in her chest stirred. Her fingers twitched as though they remembered something they had not done in a long time. But she quickly forced her eyes away and continued working. That piano belonged to a world she no longer lived in. The tycoon rarely used the hall except when he invited guests. That particular week, he had planned a formal dinner with a few business partners. The staff worked harder than usual, polishing the silverware until it reflected like mirrors, arranging flowers carefully, checking every corner for dust. On the evening of the dinner, the mansion buzzed with quiet tension. The new maid moved quickly as she helped set the table and organize the menu cards. Everyone knew the tycoon had high expectations when guests were present. He wanted everything flawless, not only because he cared about appearance, but also because he enjoyed showing that his household was just as controlled and perfect as his business. The guests began arriving one by one. Expensive cars rolled onto the driveway. The sound of soft conversation filled the hall. The tycoon welcomed each visitor with a polite smile, though his eyes still had that distant sharpness. He enjoyed being admired, and evenings like this gave him that chance. The staff stayed in the background as they served drinks and guided guests to their seats. The new maid kept her movements steady and quiet, determined to avoid any mistake. But in a moment of hurry, as she turned to place a tray on a side table, her elbow brushed against a glass. It wobbled. She reached for it, but it slipped from her hand and fell. The sharp sound of breaking glass sliced through the lively conversation. The hall went silent. The guests turned. The tycoon's eyes tightened. She froze where she stood, her breath caught in her throat. It was just one glass. It could happen to anyone. But in this mansion, even a small mistake felt huge. The tycoon stepped forward. "Is it really that hard to hold a simple tray?" he said in a calm but cutting voice. The guests exchanged glances. Some looked amused. Others looked uncomfortable. The maid bowed her head and quietly apologized. Her hands were trembling. She lowered herself to pick up the broken pieces, but the tycoon raised a hand. "Leave it," he said. "You've already made enough noise." Stood still as another staff member stepped in to clean the mess. She could feel the heat rising in her face, but she didn't lift her eyes. She wanted to disappear. The tycoon, sensing the attention of his guests, decided to turn the moment into something he considered entertainment. Looked at her again, this time with a cold smirk. "If you must do something," he said, "go." "To the piano?" She lifted her head slightly, confused. "Sir?" "Yes." he said. "Perhaps you can at least press a few keys without dropping them." A few guests chuckled quietly. He was trying to make the room laugh, trying to show he had control over every situation. The piano sat in the middle of the hall like a stage, waiting for someone to stand on it. The maid's heart raced. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she didn't know how. But refusing him in front of guests would only make things worse. She slowly walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she reached it, she placed her hand. On the bench, her fingers shook. She sat down carefully. The hall grew quiet again, waiting to see her embarrass herself, waiting to see her struggle. The tycoon crossed his arms and watched closely, expecting a poor attempt. Maybe a few awkward sounds, maybe a clumsy rhythm. In his mind, this would balance the humiliation of the broken glass. The maid took a deep breath. She lifted her hands above the keys. Her fingers hovered uncertainly for a moment. Memories she had buried long ago began to rise. The music she had once lived for. Hours she had spent practicing. Dreams she left behind, but she didn't want anyone to know that part of her life. She didn't want the eyes of strangers to weigh on her like this. She wished she could melt into the bench and disappear. Still, she pressed the first key. A soft, clean note echoed through the hall. Then another. And another. Her fingers began to move on their own, smoothly, calmly, as though they had never forgotten the language they once knew. She played with gentle confidence, her hands gliding across the keys as the melody grew. The sound filled the hall, warm and steady. The guests looked at one another, surprised. Their amusement faded. Her expressions softened. The tycoon's posture changed slightly. His eyebrows drew in. He uncrossed his arms. He did not expect this, not even close. The maid played a piece she used to practice as a young girl, something simple but beautiful. She didn't try to impress anyone. She only let her hands move the way they remembered. For a few minutes, she forgot where she was. She forgot the broken glass, the guests, the humiliation. All that existed was the piano and the quiet story her fingers told. When the final note faded, the hall felt different, softer. Still no one laughed. No one smiled mockingly. The guests looked thoughtful, quietly impressed. The maid lowered her hands and stared at the keys. She felt exposed, like she had revealed a piece of her heart she had meant to keep hidden. She stood up slowly and stepped away. The tycoon did not speak for a moment. He seemed lost in thought, as though trying to understand what he had just witnessed. He had intended to humiliate her, not uncover something rare. He cleared his throat and looked away, pretending the moment meant nothing. But behind his steady expression, something unsettled him. He felt a strange discomfort, not from anger but from surprise and guilt. The evening continued, but the tone had shifted. The guests no longer looked at the maid with amusement, watched her with quiet curiosity. The tycoon remained unusually quiet as the dinner went on. He didn't make jokes. He didn't speak sharply. His mind replayed the melody again and again. The maid returned to her duties, but her mind was restless. She had tried so hard to leave her past behind, yet in a single moment it had risen again. She didn't know what this would mean for her. She didn't know if it would bring trouble or change, but that night, the mansion felt different from the staff to the guests, especially inside the tycoon's own thoughts. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew something had shifted in that hall when she touched the piano keys. The night after the dinner, the mansion felt unusually quiet. The staff moved around with softer steps, as if they were still holding on to the calm that settled. In the hall, after the maid played the piano, even the air felt different, lighter somehow, though no one wanted to say it out loud. The maid woke up early, long before sunrise, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a moment. She replayed everything that had happened the night before, every note she played, every startled look on the guests' faces, and the tycoon's frozen expression. She had not touched a piano in a long time, and she never imagined she would do so under so much pressure. She certainly never imagined that the sound of her hands on the keys would silence a room full of wealthy business people. A part of her felt relieved that she didn't embarrass herself, but a bigger part of her felt exposed. She didn't want attention. She came here only to work and earn enough to support herself. She didn't want anyone asking questions about her past, but the moment she touched the keys, old memories rose like dust shaken from a forgotten shelf. Warm memories, painful memories, small hopes she had locked away. She shook them off as she dressed for the new day. When she stepped into the hallway, she expected the same strict routine: cleaning, polishing, organizing. But the staff greeted her differently. The older housekeeper smiled wider than usual and gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You played beautifully last night," she whispered. The maid lowered her eyes shyly. "Thank you. I didn't mean to draw attention." "Oh, don't worry," the housekeeper replied with a soft laugh. "If anything, you surprised everyone in the best way." As the maid walked through the mansion, she noticed the respectful way others looked at her, not with pity or amusement, but with quiet admiration. It felt strange. She wasn't used to people looking at her like that. She tried to push the thought aside and begin her morning tasks. But something else felt different. The tycoon was awake. Earlier than usual, he rarely appeared at that hour. Normally, he stayed in his study or bedroom until the staff finished their morning duties. But on this day, he stepped into the hall just as the maid was dusting a shelf. She turned quickly, startled. His face showed none of the sharp irritation he usually carried early in the day. Instead, he looked deep in thought, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat. "You're up early." She quietly nodded. "Yes, sir." He glanced toward the piano, then back at her. Something in his eyes shifted, as though he wanted to speak but wasn't sure how. "You played well yesterday," he said finally, though he spoke as if the words tasted strange to him. She lowered her gaze. "Thank you, sir." Silence stretched between them for a moment. He wasn't used to giving compliments, and she wasn't used to receiving any from him. "You studied before?" he asked. She hesitated. "A long time ago." He waited for more, but she didn't continue. She didn't want to share her story, not with him. Not after how he treated her the night before. The tycoon seemed to understand that she wasn't ready to talk. He nodded shortly and turned away, walking toward his study. But before he reached the door, he stopped. "The hall will be cleaned later," he said over his shoulder. "If you wish to play again, the piano is not off limits during your break." Her heart skipped. He didn't say it kindly, but he didn't say it sharply either. It was unusual, unexpected. Then he disappeared into his study, leaving her standing there with the dust cloth frozen in her hand. For the rest of the morning, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. Why did he allow her to touch the piano? He never let anyone touch anything in the hall, not even the staff who polished the furniture. Everything had rules. Was it guilt? Was it curiosity? Or something else? She tried to focus on her work. She scrubbed, folded, organized, but her mind kept floating back to the piano. During her first short break, she didn't go near it. She stayed in the kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to quiet her thoughts. But during the afternoon, when the house became quieter and the staff spread out to different rooms, she found herself walking toward the hall again. Her steps were slow, unsure. She didn't intend to play. She only wanted to look at it. The polished surface reflected the soft afternoon light. The keys were clean and still, untouched since last night. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers curling slightly as if drawn to the instrument by memory alone. But she didn't sit down. Just then she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned, startled. It was the tycoon. He paused when he saw her standing by the piano. He looked almost surprised to find her there. "You're not working?" he asked, though not in an accusatory tone. "It's my break." "Sir," she replied quietly. He nodded, his gaze shifting from her hands to the piano bench. "You didn't play," he said, observing. She shook her head slightly. "I didn't want to disturb anyone." "There's no one to disturb," he said. "I don't mind." The last sentence came out softer than he intended. As soon as he said it, he looked away, as if uncomfortable with his own tone. She didn't know how to respond. She had lived many years being careful around people who had power over her. She didn't want to misunderstand kindness, especially from someone who had once used her as a target for amusement. "You don't have to play," he added quickly, almost defending himself. "It was only a suggestion." She nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." He stood there for a few seconds, then retreated again to his study, leaving her alone with the quiet piano. This time she sat. Her fingers touched the keys gently. Wait, she didn't play anything complicated, just a small tune she remembered from childhood. A soft, simple melody, something that always reminded her of a peaceful moment she once had, long before her life turned difficult. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slowed. The music felt like warm water flowing through her veins while she played. She didn't notice that the tycoon had stepped out of his study again. He stood partially hidden behind the doorway, listening. He didn't understand music very well, but he understood emotion. And something about the way she played, soft, steady, yet full of feeling, stirred something unsteady inside him. He had built his life around control, around sharp decisions and harder walls. But her music didn't break the walls. It seeped through them quietly. He stepped back before she noticed him and returned to his study, closing the door gently. Yet even with the door shut, the melody reached him. He sat behind his desk and stared at the papers he was supposed to be reviewing but couldn't focus on. That was the beginning of something he did not expect. Days passed. The routine in the mansion slowly changed. The maid continued her duties, sweeping the halls, polishing the floors, arranging rooms, but almost every day. During a short break, she found herself sitting at the piano again. Not for long. Just a few minutes each time, enough to remind her hands of what they once knew, enough to calm her mind, and nearly every time she played without her noticing. The tycoon paused whatever he was doing to listen. He never said anything about it. He didn't compliment her again. He didn't try to talk. But something about the music softened him in ways even he didn't realize. One afternoon, as she finished playing a gentle tune, she heard quiet clapping from behind her. She turned sharply. It wasn't the tycoon. It was one of the kitchen staff, smiling warmly. "That was beautiful," the woman said softly. The maid blushed. "It's nothing. It's practice. Make the whole house feel peaceful," the woman replied. "Even the boss seems calmer." These days, the maid didn't know whether that was true. She didn't dare assume anything about the tycoon's mood. But she did notice small changes. He no longer spoke to her sharply. He no longer looked at her with irritation. And sometimes he paused as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. Still, she kept her distance. She didn't want to confuse the comfort of playing music with the false hope of being treated differently. She had lived long enough to know that kindness could be temporary. One evening, as the staff finished setting the dining table for a small meeting the tycoon planned to have, he called her over. She approached carefully. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, then asked, "What was the name of the piece you played this morning?" She blinked, taken aback. "It was just a small tune I learned when I was young." He nodded slowly. It sounded steady, clear. Didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. He looked at her again, his gaze softer than usual. "You may continue playing during your breaks," he said. "It helps you." Something in his tone felt genuine, not like a command, but like permission. She bowed her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir." As she walked away, the tycoon watched her quietly. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, but he knew the mansion felt different lately. Less cold, less empty. And though he didn't admit it, even to himself, he knew exactly why. The quiet music that flowed through the halls was no longer just a pleasant sound. It was starting to change him, and he wasn't sure whether he was ready for a tour afraid of it. The morning sun rose quietly over the mansion, spilling soft light across the large windows and empty hallways. The maid stepped out of her small room, tying the apron around her waist as she prepared for another long day. But something felt different. The house no longer carried the same heavy silence it once did. There was a gentler mood in the air, quiet warmth that had slowly settled in ever since the piano keys began to sound again. She didn't know if anyone else felt it as strongly as she did, but she noticed the small changes, the way the staff seemed more relaxed, the way the tycoon no longer snapped impatiently at every tiny mistake. in the way the halls no longer felt like cold museum rooms, but living spaces filled with gentle echoes of music. Still, she tried not to think too much about these changes. She didn't want to read meaning where none might exist. She had lived long enough to understand that soft moments sometimes disappeared as quickly as they came. But the tycoon had changed, not completely and not loudly. But something in him had shifted. He walked differently, less stiff, less rushed. He spoke with fewer sharp edges. Though he didn't smile, his eyes seemed less guarded, as if he was carrying fewer invisible weights on his shoulders. Yet he remained distant. The maid continued her routine that morning, dusting the hall table and polishing the glass vases. She kept her mind focused on her tasks. She tried to stay invisible, just as she always had, but she could not hide forever. The tycoon stepped out of his study earlier than usual, holding a folder in his hands. His expression was thoughtful. When he saw her standing near the entrance of the hall, he paused. "Good morning," he said. She blinked, surprised. He had never greeted her before, not directly, not first. "Good morning, sir," she replied softly. He hesitated before asking, "Do you have a moment?" She nodded and stepped closer, though her heart beat faster. She didn't know what he wanted, and she couldn't forget the night he had humiliated her in front of his guests. That memory still held a quiet sting. He handed her the folder but didn't explain. She looked down at it, unsure if she should open it. "You can look," he said. She slowly opened the folder. Inside were a few old documents, faded with time. Certificates. Music sheets she recognized from classical training. A worn photograph of a small music studio. Her hands trembled slightly. "These were found in the storage room," the tycoon said, watching her reaction carefully. "They belonged to the previous owner of the house. I thought you might understand them better than I do." She stared at the pages for a long moment, running her fingers lightly over the music notes printed on the sheets. They felt familiar, comforting. She looked up. "Why did you show me this?" He shifted his weight slightly, as if unsure of his own answer. "Goes, you seem to know music and I do not." Her breath steadied. This was not the man she had met on her first day. This was someone trying carefully, awkwardly, to bridge a distance he had built between them. "I only played a little," she said. "It was a long time ago. It doesn't change what I heard," he replied quietly. She fell silent. She didn't know how to respond to the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, they stood without speaking. The morning light casting long shadows across the polished floor. Then he said something she'd never expected. "You learned music formally, didn't you?" She hesitated. "Yes. How far did you go?" I asked. She swallowed. "Not a farther than most, but not far enough." Life became difficult. He didn't question her further. He didn't pry. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he understood things she didn't say. "That happens," he said quietly. "Even to people who seem to have everything." She looked up, surprised by the honesty in his words. His tone wasn't cold. It wasn't arrogant. It held something vulnerable, something she had never heard from him before. One or the other. Staff members suddenly appeared from the kitchen doorway, and the tycoon stepped back slightly, as if shielding his softer side from the world. "You may keep the folder for now," he said. "I thought it might help you reconnect." Held the folder close to her chest. He nodded once, then returned to his study. She watched him go, wondering how a man so stern could speak with such unexpected gentleness. Throughout the morning, she found herself touching the folder now and then, feeling the weight of the music. Sheets inside, old memories of classrooms, practice rooms, small concerts, and hopeful dreams filled her mind. She had left that world behind because she had no choice. But now, it felt as though someone had handed her a small window back into it. As the hours passed, the mansion settled into its usual rhythm. The staff worked quietly, the kitchen filled with the soft sound of chopping and simmering, and the hall filled with the faint warmth of sunlight darting her afternoon break. She walked toward the piano again, not because she wanted to play, but because something drew her to it. She placed the folder on the bench and slowly opened it. She looked through the old sheets and traced the notes with her fingertips. Her breathing softened. She sat down, This time she played a melody she had once loved deeply a piece she used to practice for hours until her fingers grew tired. A melody filled with longing and quiet strength. Her hands glided across the keys, waking up emotions she had buried for years. She didn't notice the tears that gathered quietly in her eyes. She didn't notice the small crack in her voice when she exhaled. And once again, she didn't notice the tycoon standing nearby. He had walked out of his study when he heard the first note. Something about her playing always stopped him. He watched her from across the hall, careful not to intrude. He noticed the quiet sadness in the way she held her shoulders, the slight tremble in her hands when she moved to a higher note, the way she seemed lost in memories he couldn't see. He also noticed when she wiped a small tear from her cheek. For a long moment, he didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, listening. When she finished, her hands stilled on the keys. She opened her eyes and gasped softly when she saw him standing there. Sir, I didn't know you were here." He stepped forward slowly, his voice quiet. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." She lowered her gaze, embarrassed that he had seen her emotional. He looked at the music sheets scattered on the bench and asked, "Do these pieces mean a lot to you?" She nodded gently. "Yes, they were a big part of my life." He studied her face carefully. Why did you stop?" She took a slow breath. "Sometimes life doesn't let you keep the things you love." He paused at that. The words echoed in him more deeply than she realized. "I understand," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. She didn't expect him to relate to her at all. He turned toward the window, speaking more to the room than to her. "People assume wealth protects you from loss. But it doesn't. It only hides it." His voice held an ache she had never heard before. She didn't know what pain he carried, and she didn't ask. She only listened. After a moment, he turned back to her. "If playing helps you, then you should continue. Not for anyone else, just for yourself." His words settled gently in the room. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." He glanced at the piano one last time before stepping back. Before leaving, he added, "Music suits this house, makes it feel alive again." When he walked away, she sat still for a long time, trying to understand the strange shift happening between them. He wasn't becoming kind, at least not in the way people usually meant. Instead, he was becoming less polished, less guarded, more human, and she didn't know whether that made her feel safer or more exposed. That evening, as she carried fresh linens up the stairs, she heard voices coming from the dining room. The tycoon was meeting with two business guests. They spoke in low tones, discussing numbers, contracts, projects. Then one guest said, "Your house feels different lately, more welcoming." The tycoon didn't respond immediately. She paused in the hallway, listening without meaning to. "It's the music," the guest said with a small laugh. "Heard someone playing earlier. Quite impressive." "Oh." The tycoon cleared his throat. "One of the staff plays during her break." "Interesting," the guest said. "You never allowed that before?" There was a long pause. Then the tycoon replied softly, "People grow." Those two simple words lingered in the air. The maid walked away quietly, her heart full and confused at the same time. The mansion was changing. He was changing, and whether she liked it or not, her music was at the center of it. The days passed. Quietly, each blending into the next, with a soft rhythm that had begun to settle over the mansion. The maid continued her daily work with care and precision, her hands moving efficiently, but her mind often drifted back to the piano and the small, stolen moments of music she allowed herself during breaks, so those moments had become her solace. The one part of the day where she could breathe without carrying the weight of servitude and expectations, the tycoon, on the other hand, observed these small moments more closely than he realized. He had not spoken much about it, but each note she played left a trace in him, a quiet impression that lingered long after the sound had faded. He noticed how the house seemed lighter when she practiced, how even the staff moved differently, as though the air carried a subtle shift in mood, yet he remained cautious, careful not to show that her music affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. One afternoon, as the maid carried a tray of tea into the sunlit hall, she found him Standing near the piano, watching her with an expression she could not read, her heart beat faster, unsure whether he would speak or simply leave her alone. "You play often," he said quietly, his voice low, almost conversational. She set the tray down, bowing her head politely. "During breaks?" "Yes, sir." He nodded and gestured toward the piano. "May I hear you play something new today?" Her hands froze. She hadn't prepared anything new, and her self-consciousness flared. I only know the pieces I have been practicing," she murmured. "That will do," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It was the first time she had seen him smile without the formal stiffness he usually carried. She sat down hesitantly. Opening the folder of music sheets he had given her, she chose a piece that was slightly more complex than the simple melodies. She had been playing something she had only briefly learned years ago, but had never performed for anyone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys, and then she played. The melody filled the hall, richer and more intricate than before. She lost herself in the music, letting her fingers tell the story she had kept buried for so long. Each note seemed to carry a fragment of her past, a memory, a hope, or a sorrow. She played with a quiet intensity that drew the tycoon's attention completely. Leaving him momentarily rooted to the spot, he didn't understand the music in technical terms, but he understood its power. He could feel the emotions she poured into it, the careful attention to each note, the delicate timing that made the piece rise and fall naturally. It wasn't just sound, it was an expression of her soul, as the final note lingered in the air. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys, feeling a wave of exhaustion. The tycoon remained silent for a moment, absorbing the performance. Then he spoke, his voice steady but soft. "You are better than I expected." Her eyes widened slightly, startled by the compliment. She had become accustomed to his sharp words and critiques, not praise. "I thank you, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't hide this," he continued. "Not for anyone, not for yourself even. Music like this deserves attention." She looked at him, unsure whether he meant it for her benefit or as some form of rare acknowledgement. I don't think anyone here would care," she said softly. He shook his head. "I care. I notice. And so should you. Don't let your talent fade away." His words were different from any she had ever heard. They were neither a command nor a critique. They were simple, honest, and surprisingly encouraging. She felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Could the man who had once tried to humiliate her now be urging her to embrace her talent? Days turned into weeks, and a quiet routine formed. The maid continued her work with the same care and diligence, but now she allowed herself small musical interludes during breaks. The tycoon rarely interrupted, though he often lingered nearby, listening in silence. She could feel his presence, but it no longer carried the weight of judgment. Instead, it felt watchful, curious, and even protective. During one afternoon, a gentle rain began to fall outside, the soft patter of droplets on the windows creating a calming rhythm. She sat at the piano, glancing at the folder of sheets he had given her, and chose a piece she had never played for anyone. The notes were delicate and intricate, weaving a story that was both melancholy and hopeful. As she played, the sound of the rain blended with the music, creating a symphony of quiet intimacy that filled the hall. The tycoon watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable yet attentive. He couldn't explain why her playing affected him so deeply, why it seemed to soften even the hardest parts of him. It was a feeling he had not experienced before. When the piece ended, she lifted her hands slowly, feeling a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. He stepped into the hall, closing the distance between them. "You play with feeling," he said quietly. "Not just notes. You tell a story." She felt her cheeks warm. I only try to remember the music. Remember more than thee?" "Music," he replied, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "You remember yourself." She blinked, unsure what to say. No one had ever noticed that before. Aught her past, her struggles, or the small victories she had carried in silence. And now, the tycoon, the man she had once feared, seemed to understand a part of her that no one else did as the days went on. The tycoon began to make subtle changes in the mansion. He allowed her more freedom with the piano, moving it closer to the main hall so the music could fill the space more naturally. He even instructed the staff to avoid interrupting her during practice. The atmosphere in the house became lighter, warmer, more alive. She began to notice that her confidence was returning. Her fingers moved more fluidly over the keys, and her heart no longer raced with fear every time she played. The music became a source of strength, not just an escape. It reminded her that she was more than a maid, more than her past struggles, more than anyone had believed. One evening, the tycoon approached her as she packed away the music sheets. "There's an event next week," he said, a small gathering of business associates. "I want you to play." Her heart skipped. I don't think I should, sir. I'm not ready." He studied her carefully. "I understand. But if you choose to, it's an opportunity. Not for me, not for anyone else. For you. You've let this talent sit too long. Perhaps it's time to share it again." She hesitated, unsure of what to say. The idea of playing in front of others terrified her, yet a small part of her stirred with curiosity and hope. Could she really step back into the world she had left behind? "I'll think about it," she said finally. He nodded. "All I ask? Take your time." The rain began to fall again that evening, tapping softly against the windows. She sat at the piano, opening the folder of sheets once more. She played quietly, letting the music flow naturally, blending with the rhythm of the storm. The tycoon stood in the doorway, listening in silence, quiet respect in his gaze. And in that quiet space, something unspoken passed between them. A fragile trust, a recognition of talent, a tentative connection that neither could fully explain. The mansion, once a place of strict rules and cold precision, was slowly transforming into a place of warmth, creativity, possibility. The maid continued to play, the notes floating through the hall, carrying a promise of change. And the tycoon, standing in the shadows, realized that her music had begun to soften not only the house, but something inside him that he had long thought. Unyielding, it was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, one built not on fear or hierarchy, but on respect, understanding, the quiet power of talent rediscovered. The week passed in quiet anticipation. The maid continued her work in her secret musical practice during breaks. Each day her confidence grew, her fingers moving over the keys with more ease, her melodies more expressive and bold. The mansion itself seemed to breathe differently. The walls that once felt cold and distant now held the sound of music that brought a strange sense of warmth and life. When the day of the gathering arrived, the house buzzed with unusual energy. Staff moved with purpose but with an undercurrent of excitement. For once, they were not fearful of mistakes or judgment. They carried trays of drinks and hors d'oeuvres, whispering quietly among themselves, curious about the performance they were about to witness. The tycoon, usually distant and impassive, seemed slightly different as well. He gave short, precise instructions but lingered near the hall, checking every detail. The grand chandelier sparkled overhead, the polished floor reflected the soft light. The guests began to arrive in their elegant attire. Their conversations hummed softly, but the anticipation in the room was subtle, yet tangible. The maid waited quietly in her small room, the folder of music sheets clutched in her hands. Her heart raced. She had never performed in front of anyone since leaving the music world years ago. The idea of facing an audience filled her with nervousness. Her hands trembled slightly as she thought about playing perfectly, about the expectations, about the judgment she might face. The tycoon entered her room unexpectedly. His presence made her freeze. "You're ready?" he said quietly. "Remember, this is for you. Play because it is yours. Not for them, not for me, for yourself." She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. I'll do my best." Gave a brief, approving nod and stepped back, leaving her alone to prepare mentally. She adjusted her clothing, smoothed her hair, and walked toward the hall, each step heavier than the last. yet propelled by determination. She could hear the low hum of conversation from the guests. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing on her, but she tried to focus on the music. On the feeling she wanted to convey. The piano sat in the center of the hall, its polished surface gleaming. She opened the folder and selected the piece she had been practicing most confidently. Taking a deep breath, she sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. She started with a gentle note, soft and cautious. The room quieted almost. Immediately, guests noticed the delicate sound and leaned slightly forward, curious. The tycoon stood at the edge of the hall, his gaze steady, observing without intruding. He was not smiling, but there was a quiet approval in his eyes. The maid's confidence grew as she continued. Her fingers moved fluidly, the melody flowing naturally. She played with emotion, with intention, with the deep feeling that had long been buried within her. The music was not just notes on a page. It was a story of years of longing, struggle, and quiet hope. Guests sat in silence, captivated by the unexpected talent before them. Their initial curiosity transformed into admiration, a soft awe. Some leaned closer, trying to catch every nuance, every subtle rise and fall of the notes. The mansion itself seemed to respond to her playing, every corner filled with warmth and resonance. The tycoon's expression softened. He had expected a polite, cautious performance, perhaps a simple melody to entertain his guests. Instead, he was witnessing something profound. Her playing carried more than technical skill. It carried authenticity, emotion, and the truth of her experiences. As the piece progressed, the maid's initial nervousness vanished. She lost herself entirely in the music, letting it speak for her. The trembling in her hands disappeared, replaced by fluidity and confidence. Her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, and the room seemed to hold its breath with her. When she reached the final notes, she allowed them to linger, soft and fading, until the silence enveloped the hall completely. The guests remained still for a moment, as if unsure how to respond to the profound beauty they had just heard. Then came the quiet, polite applause. At first, small and hesitant, but it quickly grew. The sound was not mocking or superficial, it was sincere. They had been touched by her performance, by the honesty of the music. The tycoon clapped too, quietly at first, then with a measured appreciation that carried the weight of acknowledgement. He had seen her not just as an employee or a figure of amusement, but as someone with talent, depth, and spirit. The maid opened her eyes, slightly embarrassed, yet a quiet satisfaction fill. She had played not for approval, not for reward, but because it was her truth. And in that moment, it had been recognized. A man in the back of the room, someone she did not recognize, stepped forward. He introduced himself as a representative from a local music foundation, someone who discovered young talents and helped them pursue further education and opportunities. He praised her performance, expressing genuine admiration and offering guidance and possibilities for training and growth. The maid listened quietly, overwhelmed and amazed. She had never imagined anyone outside her personal life could see her talent and value it so openly. The tycoon stood nearby, observing the interaction. He felt a sense of pride, but it was quiet and personal, not boastful. He had played a role, but it was her dedication, her skill, her courage that had brought her to this moment. The rest of the evening passed in a soft hum of conversation, the guests discussing her performance, the nuances of her skill, and the promise of her potential. She moved through the room with quiet composure, her heart light yet full. The anxiety that had gripped her for weeks lifted, placed by a sense of belonging and recognition. After the guests had left and the mansion quieted down, the maid returned to the hall. She sat at the piano once more, fingers tracing familiar keys, not to perform, but to feel the music that had returned to her life. The tycoon approached quietly, standing in the doorway, observing without interrupting. He had learned patience, respect, and the value of encouragement. He had seen the power of recognizing another person's potential. "You were remarkable tonight," he said softly. She looked up, a small smile forming on her lips. "Thank you, sir." He nodded, satisfied. Remember this feeling, this confidence. It is yours. The maid closed her eyes and let her hands hover above the keys, feeling the rhythm and silence. She understood that this was more than a performance. It was a beginning, reclaiming of a part of herself that she had thought lost forever. It was a reminder that talent, when nurtured and respected, could open doors to possibilities previously unimaginable. From that day on, her life began to change. The tycoon continued to allow her freedom with the piano. He quietly encouraged her, arranged for her to meet professionals, created opportunities within the house to nurture her talent. The mansion became a place not just of work, but of learning, growth, and music. Her relationship with the tycoon shifted as well. There was no longer fear or tension, only mutual respect. He had learned humility, the quiet power of encouragement, and the lesson that recognizing talent and humanity could transform not just others, but himself and the maid who had once entered. The mansion, as an unnoticed worker now, carried herself with quiet confidence. Her music filling the halls and touching everyone who listened. She had reclaimed her dreams, and in the process, had shown that true talent cannot remain hidden forever. Even in the most unlikely places. Months passed since that first gathering, and the mansion had transformed. It was no longer a place of strict formality and cold routines. Music flowed through the halls at various times of the day, quiet yet persistent, echoing the growth and confidence of the maid who had reclaimed it. She had become a fixture not only in the staff's daily rhythm but also in the household's heartbeat. A gentle presence that reminded everyone of humanity and talent beyond social roles. The tycoon had changed too. The edges of his harshness softened, not completely, but enough that people noticed a shift. He was more patient, more observant, and most importantly, more willing to see the people around him as individuals, with their own stories and abilities. The respect he had learned to show to the maid slowly extended to others, changing the atmosphere of the house in subtle ways that staff and guests alike could feel. For the maid, life was no longer only about work. Music had become a central part of her existence, a source of joy, confidence, and expression. Her skills had grown immensely since the first hesitant notes she played in secret, and her comfort with performing had deepened. She had begun to take opportunities beyond the mansion, meeting other musicians, receiving guidance, and exploring the possibilities that had once seemed unreachable. One bright morning, the maid entered the hall and sat at the piano before any other staff arrived. She had chosen a new composition she'd been working on, something more complex and demanding than anything she had attempted before. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, letting the notes slowly rise, delicate and careful, as she played. She felt a sense of calm and purpose, her thoughts focused solely on the music. The tycoon quietly appeared at the doorway, a faint smile on his lips. He did not interrupt, simply listened, letting the melody fill the hall and seep into the spaces of the house. He had grown accustomed to her playing. Yet each performance still brought a quiet fascination, a recognition of skill and emotion he could not easily articulate. The music flowed effortlessly, each phrase building on the last, a story told without words. The maid's hands moved with precision and grace, her face calm yet expressive. The hall, now accustomed to her presence and her sound, seemed to respond to her playing. The soft sunlight through the tall windows, the polished floors reflecting the notes, and the gentle movement of the chandelier created a harmony that extended beyond the music itself. After finishing the piece, she allowed the final notes to linger in the air, savoring the quiet that followed. She opened her eyes and looked toward the doorway where the tycoon stood. He nodded, not in judgment or expectation, but in genuine acknowledgement. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "It feels like a long time since I played for anyone."
Apps.
He replied, "But I think it is just the beginning." Her thoughts turned to the months of practice, the moments of doubt, and the careful steps of rebuilding confidence. All of it had led to this point: comfort in her own talent, recognition of her own potential, and the quiet understanding that she was capable of more than she had allowed herself to believe. The tycoon watched her, reflecting on the changes in himself. The harshness, the strict routines, and the detached authority had once defined his presence in the house. But the maid had taught him a subtle lesson without intending to. That recognition, respect, and encouragement could inspire growth and transformation, not just for her, but for everyone around them. The day of the next gathering arrived, and this time the maid was no longer nervous. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her music filled with purpose and grace. Guests entered the mansion, unaware of the profound transformation that had taken place. They were greeted by the warmth and charm of the environment, the result of the music, the household's careful attention, the quiet influence of the maid's growing presence. When it was time for her to play, she walked into the hall and took her place at the piano. She opened the folder of sheets, selecting a piece she had mastered completely, her fingers poised confidently on the keys. As the music began, it swept through the room, capturing the attention of everyone present. The melodies told a story, delicate yet powerful, filled with the emotion she had poured into years of practice and experience. The tycoon stood nearby, observing quietly, his usual stern expression softened. He saw the admiration on the faces of the guests, the subtle reactions to each note, the quiet respect that had grown for the maid. He understood, more than ever, that talent was not a gift to be hidden or controlled, but a flame to be nurtured and shared. When the final note faded, the room erupted in genuine applause. The maid rose from the piano, her heart filled with satisfaction and pride. She had played for herself, yet the recognition of others affirmed her journey, her efforts, and her reclaimed confidence. The tycoon stepped forward, breaking the applause with a gentle hand gesture. He addressed the guests, praising her performance not only for its technical mastery, but for the depth of emotion it conveyed. The guests listened, some nodding in understanding, others smiling, all impressed by the skill and grace that had been so carefully honed over the months. Later, after the gathering had ended and the guests departed, the mansion quieted once more. The maid returned to the piano, sitting down with the same calm focus that had carried her through years of practice. The tycoon observed from a distance, his presence quiet yet steady, a silent acknowledgement of her talent and the journey she had undertaken. "You've done more than impress me," he said softly. "You've reminded me of what it means to truly see someone, to respect and support them. That lesson is invaluable." She looked up, a small smile forming. "I'm glad to hear that, sir. Music has taught me many things too," he nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. The house was alive with music now, not just from the piano, but from the subtle shifts in the way everyone interacted, moved, and appreciated the talents of others. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion continued to thrive under this quiet harmony. The maid's confidence grew, her music more refined, her presence more acknowledged. She had become a symbol of talent nurtured with respect, courage in the face of doubt, and the quiet power of reclaiming one's life. The tycoon had learned lessons that money and authority could not teach. He had learned humility, the importance of encouragement, and the transformative effect of seeing another person's potential without bias or judgment. The